Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I am AA Ron, and this is the Inclusive Dad Podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me in exploring ways we can create a more inclusive world together. You are important, you matter, and you can make a difference. Today, my guest is Lois Letchford. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Aaron. It's lovely to be here.
Why don't you start us off just telling me a little bit about yourself?
My story began in 1994 when my second son, Nicholas, failed first grade. And the failure was dramatic, that he couldn't do anything in the classroom. And what I didn't know was that the teacher shouted at him every day. At the end of that year, we get school testing, and the testing reveals that he has got no strengths. He's got a low IQ, and above all, he'll never do anything, was the diagnosis. Our family are privileged. My husband's a professor, and the following year, we had 6 months of study leave. My husband had study leave, and we followed, and we went to Oxford, and I thought, I'm going to work with Nicholas. That 6 months of having a blank slate was life-changing. I started with a series of books called Success for All, phonics-based decoding. Couldn't do anything. He couldn't do it. You'd read through these 3-letter words and you get to the end of the page, go back to the first word, and you're starting again every time. And that gave me the opportunity to say, if it's not working, change it. Mm-hmm. And my mother-in-law was with me, and she was the one who said, Lois, make learning fun. And that was my only rule. And with that, I started to write a few little poems, and the classroom transformed because he was then happy. He was smiling. I was reading them to him. We're finding the rhyming words. He's illustrating with my mother-in-law. And we just went on and on and on and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. And then the double O's come up, as in look, book, and cook. And I wrote this poem about Captain James Cook. There's a Captain Cook had a notion, there's a gap in the map in the great big ocean. And he took a look without the help of any book, hoping to find a quiet little nook. Simple poem, rhyming, with huge ideas. And we're also in Oxford. And Oxford's artifacts are just astounding. We're looking at maps. We're exploring maps. And Nicholas said to me, who came before Captain Cook? And I said, oh, that's easy, Nicholas. That was Christopher Columbus. And he says, and who came before Columbus? And I'm shocked. I've had a child who's diagnosed as can't do anything. And what I'm seeing is this child with incredible thinking skills and not limited to the world that we know. Right. And because we're in Oxford, we are then able to explore who came before Columbus. And it happened to be a man called Ptolemy who lived in 250 AD. And he drew the world's first map, placed north at the top of the map, which we still use today. And so Christopher Columbus's map was over 1,000 years old. And learning became exciting. He could then, and I had a book to help me with decoding. The decoding was going well because it was hands-on. Right. Hands-on, and we get back to school, and that's when, the things really started. We go back to school, and I told the diagnostician, I'm so excited about all he's learned. And she says to me, well, I've spoken to the reading teacher, and he's gone backwards. And in fact, he's the worst child I've seen in 20 years of teaching. At which point I walk away. But it's a phrase I have never forgotten. Right. And then that afternoon, Nicholas comes home with sight words, the little words that you're supposed to just learn. And he comes home with the word saw. 2 sentences for the word saw. And the first sentence is, I saw a cat climb up a tree. And the second is, I saw a man rob a bank. Nicholas has not seen either of those. I'm not sure if you have. And then he reads, and that's right. And then he reads, I saw a cat, and he stopped. And he goes back and he says, I was a cat. No. And then I said, add a cat, and I said, and he just threw up his hands. He didn't know what to do. And I recognized eventually the problem is that he is seeing the word saw concretely. I saw a cat. I cut the cat in half. And he went, that doesn't happen.
Right.
That doesn't happen. I was a cat. I never was a cat. That hasn't happened. And the others just don't make any sense. So he's reading for meaning. And what I saw that day was how really poor teaching impacts children.
Right.
And it's the failure within the teaching that's the problem. Nicholas, as I said, has never seen a cat climb up a tree, and I can't even talk about the second one. He had been overseas for the last 6 months, and we couldn't personalise teaching and say, Nicholas, tell me what you saw. Call me up and say, what photos have you got? What can I look at to show him the word saw has got different meanings?
Right.
That is very short story was the beginning of my learning into special education and literacy reading. From then on, I became a reading specialist and my son learned to read. He went to school every day and I made sure that he could understand everything from then on. 20 plus years later, in 2018, my son Nicholas graduated with a PhD in applied mathematics from Oxford University. We're here to talk about inclusion, and that's what I want to talk about.
Wow, that's a great story. So did you have any background in any of like teaching or anything before that, your son and those stories you talked about?
I was a physical education teacher.
Okay.
And with that, you do get an idea about teaching and learning and learning of skills, and then isolated learning versus the whole learning, all of those things. But I did go back to the university and got my degree in literacy teaching, which was, critical. And then from there on, I took on other students who'd failed all reading programs. And my next student was a 13-year-old who'd sat for 4 years in a phonics-only reading program and came out non-reading, unable to read. And that's how I really got started into literacy education and taking on the toughest kids. And it's brilliant, and I love doing it. I just love doing it. I love the process, the problem solving that's involved. But inclusion.
Yeah, so I mean, my first question is, so you figured out like how your son was able to learn and learn the concepts. How was it then when he like tried to talk with his teachers, like he needs to learn this way? Were they open to it? How did you get them to kind of maybe get on board? Were you able to get them on board with teaching him in that way?
I refused to speak to the reading teacher because I was so disappointed with her attitude. It just blew me away that she couldn't see the absolute fundamental failure of what she had done. The failure lies in the teaching.
Right.
Nicholas had a third grade teacher who was absolutely the best teacher in the world. And that's what he needed. He would do his homework. I mean, she would send her homework and I would make sure that he understood that. Then you send him back to school. With the reading teacher, I understood that these sight words were really challenging for children who struggle. So I made up lessons, and one day I sent a lesson to that teacher. And it's brilliant. It's one that I use all the time with my students first up. And I never heard back from her, not a word. And I couldn't be bothered. I take so much effort to work with my son to get him from A to B. I couldn't deal with outside of that.
Right.
And I think that's what it comes down to, the mental energy it requires to take a child who is behind and to get them going. And it's the inertia of anything, isn't it, is really, really challenging. And I would do one activity of an afternoon. What's not acknowledged is that I really thought about that activity for the whole day. I was a stay-at-home mum at the time. To get the activity, to put the materials together, to find the best way it worked, to have Nicholas understand it within a short time frame. Because, they're tired after school. It was really challenging.
Yeah.
Really challenging.
So what advice do you have for parents who may not be like in your situation where they don't have it, they have to be working and they don't have like the time to do, extra teaching when the child gets home? What do you have? Do you have any advice for them and how they can support their child if they're in a similar situation?
That's a really tough one.
Yeah.
Really tough, because that requires emotional and physical effort too. Nothing comes easily. Let's go walk into school and say, we're struggling with this. And then you have this school home clash,
Yeah.
which school uses very quickly to their advantage.
Yes.
So, I think it's support your child, and it's believe in your child and tell them that every day.
Mm-hmm.
Because, as I say, my story is now old. My son is 36. And what I wanted to share with you about particularly inclusion was not only the emotional and the learning of reading, but also the social context, which is often ignored. When he went to grade 1, he had no friends. And I walked in at one lunchtime, I had to take something up, and there he is sitting, alone. No one talks to him. And what does he say to me as a 36-year-old? He said it this year. He said, I didn't understand why I didn't have any friends.
Right.
What can we do? Have someone sit by that child. He might not be able to talk, but say, that's okay that he's quiet. But just sit with him and hold his hand and say, I'm your friend.
Mm-hmm.
No one did that for my child throughout school. And when, behavior is a bit more difficult, I don't know, we need to have more behavior training for our children and social skills training so that they can learn to communicate with others as well. I get very emotional about it because, we think about reading, and reading is absolutely essential. Emotional development, I didn't understand.
Right.
And social development, I didn't understand and didn't recognize both of those components. And I'll tell you another story about emotional development, I think, which ties with inclusion. When my son graduated with his PhD, I said to him, Nicholas, I don't know what happened in first grade. I don't know anything. And he sat there on the couch and he couldn't say a thing. His tongue went round and round in his mouth and he just looked at me. No, he didn't even look at me. He just looked down because the trauma of the first grade experience was still there.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said to him, well, what happened when you and I went to Oxford and we learned together? And then, the sourness turns to an absolute smile. Mm-hmm. Well, he said, learning, I learned to love learning and I never want to stop learning. Mm-hmm. Was the first thing he said. And the second was learning about the maps, and Captain Cook taught me those things.
Yeah.
And then he started giggling and he said, you wrote a poem about witches and a witch's spell. And he's giggling like a 7-year-old. Mm. And this is 20-something years later. And he said, you wrote a witch's poem. And it was just so funny. I don't remember it, but it was just so funny. And right. when he was 7, friends would come to the door and he would run and get the book and say, read this. And it wasn't reading the poem I wrote. It was reading the ingredients that we had put into the witch's spell, which had yeah. And again, it's learning is not as simple as just learning to decode. Yeah. And we do want inclusion. And when we love our learning, we want to share it.
Right.
So yes.
Did he, the teachers, how they described him as like the worst child they'd ever had or something? I don't know if that was the exact words, but had he heard the teachers say that about him?
No.
Okay.
No. That was just a conversation between the diagnostician and me.
Okay.
Thankfully, he wasn't there.
Right.
But, that it's a horrific thing to say. Horrific.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Did you, I mean, what did you ever tell him that? Or I mean, I'm assuming you've
Yes.
shared that story.
Yeah. Well, I've written the book. My book is Reverse to Memoir, and I
Okay.
don't have a copy here with me.
Sure.
And I told the story. I told the story for many reasons.
Yep.
But one is how we teach is critical to student success.
Yeah.
That's number one reason for writing it down. And second was that we moved often with my husband's work.
Sure.
You know, with the study leaves, the 6 months here, and that moving for Nicholas really helped him. That's not normal. But you don't have to move to have those situations in place. We moved to Lubbock, Texas, and I titled this chapter A Spring in the Desert because moving from Lubbock helped him go from the bottom to the top.
Can you explain how or why that had such a big impact moving there?
Yeah. I identified 9 things that happened in Lubbock that wouldn't have happened at our home in Brisbane, Australia.
Okay.
And that's what becomes critical. And some of them are very unusual. But listening to books, do you know where Lubbock, Texas is?
I mean, I know Texas is a huge state way down south. I don't know where Lubbock is in the state.
Yeah, it's miles from anywhere.
Okay.
And it's stuck in the middle of West Texas. And the
Okay.
closest town is Amarillo is 2 hours north.
Okay.
You know, Denver's about 10 hours north. And then you go west into New Mexico. And you're on the road a lot. And I said to the librarian one day, my kids fight in the car. What do I do? And she said, here, take these books on tape. Books on tape it was then. And have them listen. And the first was Castle in the Attic. And the other one's Alienate My Homework. When we put those books on in the car, silence. Not now. It's silence, which gives you the behavior one. But what was critical for Nicholas was he's hearing the language of his peers at the rate of his peers. And we listen to that book again and again and again. What happens when you come to go back to reread it? You've got a foundation for reading. You're not reading a blank slate. You're listening to things that you know. I know what happened. And you won't get all the words. You won't be able to read all the words. But because you've heard it, you know what's going on. You can go back and then you can learn those words.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not done in isolation. And really, that was one of the huge parts to Nicholas's success.
That is interesting because like you're saying, if you would have been in a location where you didn't have long car rides, then you probably would have happened. That's interesting.
And even in Brisbane, Australia, you know, we didn't have the access to books on CD.
Okay.
There weren't, I mean, the libraries in Lubbock, there were aisles of books on CD because that's what it was at the time.
Okay.
And everyone did it. So it's normal behavior. And the big thing for me about moving from Brisbane to Lubbock was that he lost his label. He was no longer considered a dumb or a slow child. He's just a child who was behind. He was reading by the time he went to Texas, just slow.
Right.
And that listening helps you make bounds, huge jumps. Yeah. And so he topped, you know, he hit the math score. He was in academic recognition every year. And then went on to do more and more and more mathematics at the high school level, you know, which put him on the path to where he ended up.
Yeah.
So
that is interesting. Like when you talked about moving a lot, I mean, my brain goes to like the negative things about that you hear, like, you know, you're not able to get those deep connections with, you know, peers and that kind of stuff. So it's interesting to hear the perspective of, for him, it was a good thing to be able to, you know, not get away from those expectations or labels that were placed upon him and get into a new environment.
It's surprising how expectations and labels play such a role. It's unbelievable almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, all we see is a low IQ.
Yep.
You can't see a child with a language problem who's struggling on multiple levels. Yep. And he would be on the autism spectrum as well. You know, so he doesn't pick things up. They don't pick the social clues up like you expect.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of been my my philosophy about labels, like we live in the United States, obviously. So in order for my daughter to have the services she needs or to access them, she needed the diagnosis or the labels to get on, get an evaluation, get an IEP to get those. But then, I mean, just from my observations of it, once she, got the services, like those labels stick with you. And with those labels come like people hear a word and they have certain expectations about it because of one student they may have had or saw before, which is not my daughter. But then that, like you're saying, it just has a lot of stuff attached to it. And my story on the inclusion piece is she was sent to a segregated classroom because of the level of needs that she had and not even given a chance to be in the general education room. So just because of, she checked multiple boxes on how she qualified for an IEP, that was where they sent those kids. And, that's in my mind, not right. So yeah, the labels I don't like them and at all, really. I mean, I don't like them.
They cause, I think, more problems
Yes.
than they solve, but it allows us as adults to categorize,
Yep.
put kids in boxes.
Yep.
I think the part that hurts me the most is that our children are so young when this happens.
Yes.
6. And we have made a diagnosis that will impact his whole life.
Yep.
And if I hadn't had that opportunity to teach him in Oxford, I don't know what would have happened to him.
Right.
Because school had limited knowledge and interests. And the interesting part of that school we went to, the top school in the state. Everyone wants to go there. And what did they do to my child in first grade?
Right.
And then you've got communication. Not one person called me up and said, your child is struggling in school.
Yeah.
No one said the teacher's shouting at your child every day. He shouldn't be here.
Mm-hmm.
Something's got to change for this child to be okay in the world.
Right.
And none of those things happened.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how I visited my daughter early on when she was in that segregated setting, and the other kids in there were already folding towels in like first and second grade, and I was like, why are they already folding towels? Like they aren't giving a chance to like learn math and reading already. It's like, and then if you're already limiting what you think they're able to accomplish in life at that age, I mean, that's going to be their path, and it's just going to follow them. So, I mean, you really got me thinking about like how it was beneficial for him to go somewhere else. Because I mean, I know kids that have had like one behavior incident that was kind of pretty bad. It's in the file, and that, I mean, like first grade, that sticks with them the whole time they're in school if they're in the same school system, because it's everybody's heard about it, and like, oh, it might happen again. It's like it happened like one time. All of us do something one time in our lives that we're not proud of, but most of us we don't have it hung over our head all the time. But in those situations, it seems like it just sticks with kids and they can't get away from it.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And it impacts them.
Yes.
Like it impacts my son. 20 years after he'd been 7 or whatever it was,
Yep.
He's still crying over it.
Right.
I mean, that's not considered.
No.
And the exclusion, I didn't understand why no one wanted to be friends with me. Why didn't they want to be friends with him? The teacher excluded him by shouting.
Yes.
Well, number one. And no one wants to be friends with that child who can't do anything. I mean, there's no words for that.
No. What is your definition of inclusion?
I had it yesterday, and now I've forgotten. I think the words that I had from yesterday were, you don't know what anyone is struggling with. So be kind. Inclusion now is not the word that they want, is it?
No.
I mean, it's an interesting time in history.
Yes.
And I saw that statement, be kind, you don't know what anyone is struggling with. And I thought, that's amazing, because it covers a whole range of issues, none of which our children know about.
Mm-hmm.
Or what? So just be kind. Were they kind to my son in first grade? Were they kind to me? So that's my definition of inclusion. How about that?
That's a good one. Yeah, it is an interesting time for sure. I mean, I've done this podcast since last summer. I have the word inclusion tattooed on my arm. So yeah, the events of the last couple of weeks have been a little interesting, thought-provoking to say the least for me. So yeah, it's an interesting time for sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. As I look back on my life, and I'm old now. I can still do a lot of things.
Yeah.
And whatever. But to see how we can change and impact children's lives.
Right.
Once we choose to help and choose to stop and listen.
Right.
We can impact their life for positive, because the alternative is negative. We're never neutral.
Yeah.
I think that's what's also important. We are not neutral.
Right. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. What advice do you have for parents whose children might be struggling in school?
Support your child. Believe in them. Believe they are capable of doing anything. And unfortunately, then I think you have to fight for them as well. Yeah. In some way, shape, or form. And that does take a lot of energy and a lot of effort.
Yeah.
That's my advice for parents.
There you go. What is your dyslexic story? Dog.
I went through school reading words I couldn't comprehend.
Yeah.
Dogs. There's a dog outside. Sorry.
That's okay.
I couldn't comprehend, and it's only when I was working with my son, that I realized I was dyslexic. And we look at it, my mother was dyslexic. So there's a hereditary component.
Sure.
Doggies. Yeah. In my world. And so on, now 2 sons have dyslexia.
Yeah, I guess I didn't know that there's some genetics involved with that.
Yes. Yes, there's genetics involved. And it's fascinating, how much that impacted the way I teach.
Right.
Because words with multiple meaning, like the word saw, why can't you understand? Because people just expect you to know these things.
Right.
And know there's multiple meanings there. I was going to put the dogs away, then, okay. But it's fine.
It's all good.
Yeah.
You maybe already shared this, but what is one tip you can share to help the listeners be more inclusive today? Just something simple they can start today to be more inclusive.
First, when you talk to someone new, be calm, or a child that's disruptive. Be calm. I wasn't calm. Give yourself time to be calm.
Yep.
And then to accept the child. Accept them and give them time.
There you go.
To talk and to process. Because it's very difficult for a child to put an action of what's happened, to get it from their brain into words. Mm-hmm. And I think that's for many children, not just children who are learning disabled, to understand what's happened. So we have to help them with their words to share what's happened and share the story.
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about first grade. Nicholas could not have told me what happened. He didn't have the words.
Yeah. That's a great tip. Is there anything else you want to talk about that we haven't discussed?
Just words. Use words carefully and wisely.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it
Not
makes a difference.
sparingly.
Yeah, it makes a difference. For sure.
It makes a difference how we talk to children.
For sure. Where can everybody connect with you?
I have my website, loisletchford.com. I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook. I'm actually, as I said, I'm doing less, but I'm still here. So reach out to me. I've got grandbabies now, and it's just so much fun to be with them, and that's where my time is going.
Yeah.
So
I'll make sure I put all your links in the show notes and stuff so people can connect. Ready for the last? Go ahead.
My book is Reversed to Memoir, and it's a wonderful story. You laugh and you cry.
Yeah. I'll make sure I put a link for that in there as well.
Thank
Are you
you.
ready for the last question?
Yes.
Do you like Spam lunch meat? Yes or no?
No.
Wow, that was very, very passionate.
We have a funny story about that.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Ooh.
We were with friends in London, and we were at their house, and she cooked it like mincemeat. And my husband's sitting there going, "We're not eating that, are we?"
That's funny. Yeah, so I live in Austin, Minnesota, not Austin, Texas. And Austin, Minnesota is where they make Spam and where the Spam Museum is located. So I've been asking all my guests to see, just kind of a funny pop on you question at the end just to see what the reactions are. It's kind of fun.
No, we don't do Spam.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's either pretty passionate yes or a pretty passionate no. There's not a lot of middle ground. It's been kind of fun.
Yes, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today.
It's wonderful to talk to you, and I wish all the parents that listen the best and have the time and the effort to keep fighting for our kids because we change their lives.
Yes, thank you. To those listening, thank you for allowing me to be part of your journey. It is truly an honor. Please join the podcast newsletter by clicking on the link in the episode description to keep up with the latest episodes. Together, we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and be a champion for inclusion.